Welcome to the Real Estate of Things podcast. I'm your host, Dalton Elliott. Very special guest today. One of my favorite people in this whole industry to speak with. Genius, I think, is what's on his business card. But Daren Blomquist, Vice President of Market Economics at Auction.com. Daren, I cannot thank you enough for taking some time to chat with me.
Oh, wow. You're too kind. I appreciate being here. Thank you. When your email came through saying, "Hey, you want to be on the podcast?" I jumped at it. Happy to be on. Love what you're doing over there and love your audience. Your audience is a lot of our customers who are buying off of auction.com. So we love to talk to them and hear what you're hearing and share what we're hearing as well.
Yeah, beautiful. And for anyone listening, if you're not following Daren on LinkedIn, make sure you go do that. One of my favorite things about scrolling through LinkedIn, whether it's a minute at the office or when I'm laying in bed at night and can't get any sleep, is anytime I run across a Daren post, I stop and I know I'm going to be a more intelligent human after I finish downloading the information that's there. Whatever information I can actually understand from it. You do a great job of putting out good tangent data and concepts. And you mentioned auction.com. So let's kick it off. Just give me some background of you and auction.com. I'm sure everybody listening has heard of auction.com too.
Yeah, I mean, and if you haven't, welcome to auction.com. We're a site that auctions off residential real estate, and specifically the two main types of auctions that we do are foreclosure auctions, which we market those properties. And in some states, those are online auctions, but in most states, the actual auctions occur at the courthouse. You physically go there. Although we can talk about this, we're introducing technology called remote bid. Actually, we have introduced it where you can participate in those courthouse auctions from your phone, so you're not having to go to drive down to the courthouse. I won't get into that right now, but that's one type of auction. The second type of auction are the bank-owned or REO auctions. Those are typically all online. That's after the property has been foreclosed. It's owned by the bank, and so yeah, that's what we do, and we pride ourselves in doing a ton of transactions, being the largest player in this space, and really disrupting this space since we've been in it, really in the foreclosure auction space since 2012, and making the foreclosure auction a true marketplace rather than just a place where it was kind of hidden and you had to be kind of in the know in the local market to actually transact there, and there was collusion and that sort of thing going on. So we're trying to disrupt all that and make it a true marketplace.
Yeah, before we dive into the meat of foreclosures right now, you brought up one point that anytime I hear it or think about it, it frustrates me a little bit. It's like, why do we have to physically show up at a Saturday morning with a cashier's check or something if I'm going to an auction? Why in the world is it taking forever for that part of our space to advance to just sitting behind a computer, what you do at auction.com, right? That platform, that ease of use. I guess that's one question. And the second one is, when is it going to catch up to where I can sit at home and any foreclosure property anywhere, I'll be able to just eBay it up?
Yeah, I mean, you're speaking our language right there. I mean, that's one of the top 5 questions we're asking every day is how can we move this process into the 21st century? Move it into the 90s at the very least. Welcome to the 90s, Mr. Foreclosure. But it's the foreclosure is a state-run process, so it's governed by state regulation, state law, and these are laws that are written. I mean, you talk to some of our guys on the ground, it's laughable. Some of these laws are written in the 1800s, and they're based on people not having even cars, on using horses and things like that. And so we're trying to update that. It's certainly not a huge hot political item that a lot of politicians want to run on. Oh, we're going to update the foreclosure laws. So it's a little hard to make progress there, but we're pushing it as hard as we can. And this remote bid that I mentioned is actually an attempt to do that outside of not an illegal way, but it's outside of the law and saying, okay, here's the laws. The law says there has to be this physical in-person foreclosure auction, but what we're going to do is allow people to interact with that physical in-person auction through their phone. And so it's really amazing, and it's the logistics of it are, our team, and I can't claim credit for it. It's our team is doing an amazing job. Is you're on your phone, the auctioneer at the auction is doing the auction, taking bids from people who are there physically at the auction, but also bids that are coming in over our app. They're taking those as bids as well. And so that's one way that we're trying to disrupt that and make it so you can sit at your house or your work or wherever and bid on properties, without going to the auction. And a lot of these auctions are canceled at the last minute, and most of them are actually not on a Saturday, as you said. Most of them are during the week, during business hours, because that's when the government workers are working. And
Mm-hmm.
and so we're trying to do that. We're seeing it's not available in all counties, but we have it available in about 1,000 counties nationwide, that remote bid option. So we're really
Yeah.
proud of that, and we're seeing uptick on it. And one of kind of the added benefits that we actually didn't even foresee is that we launched this in, I think, March of 2020, um,
Mm-hmm.
right around the
Oh yeah.
pandemic. And so one advantage has been, you don't have to be in a crowded space. Some of these auctions are in crowded rooms, to
Yeah.
interact. And the other added benefit that we've found that we didn't really foresee is people who are new to the auction process. It's intimidating. And so you go to that in-person auction, you see all these people who know what they're doing, um,
Mm-hmm.
and you're out of it, and you're like, I'm intimidated by these veteran investors, which we love the veteran investors too, but um, it gives those newer folks a chance to participate without, um, necessarily that intimidation factor playing in. So anyway, that's one way. I mean,
Yeah.
and the REO auctions are online, which is so you can do that from anywhere, and they're over a period. They're not, excuse me, they're not at a specific, a limited time. The foreclosure auctions are usually have to be held within a 4-hour period. Um, but the online auctions are usually over a week, so you have more time on those.
Got it. Keep doing what you're doing. Keep dragging it from 18th century to 21st century. It's happening bit by bit.
Yeah.
But digging deeper here. So you and I chatted. You mentioned before Real Estate of Things podcast existed, at Lima One. You were kind enough right around 2 years ago. Crazy to think how much has happened since you and I last had that conversation. But we talked, and one big topic was foreclosures. Right, we had foreclosure moratoriums nationwide. Talk to me about investor expectations at that time. Right, like there's this moratorium, and then as soon as these start to lift, there's going to be a massive influx of foreclosures. So talk to me about how that has actually panned out, and what the foreclosure market looks like right now, and where we're heading with it.
Yeah, there was a lot of uncertainty right around the time that I think we talked, and investors were uncertain. We saw, well, I'll address this two ways in terms of supply and then demand. In terms of
Mm-hmm.
supply of foreclosures, those dropped to almost none in the first few months after the pandemic hit. And our platform accounts for roughly 40 to 50% of all foreclosure auctions taking place across the country. So we're definitely a good barometer of what's happening. And the way I look at it is percentage of I benchmark to Q1 first quarter of 2020, and if we look at the volume foreclosure our foreclosure volume relative to the first quarter of 2020, really before the pandemic hit, it dropped to close to 5% of that level. in the second quarter of 2020. And then it has gradually increased since then. And now in this first quarter of 2022, 2 years later, we're we're seeing a pandemic high in terms of foreclosure volume. However, that said, we're still at 49% of Q1 2020 levels. So we're still halfway below half of the 2020 levels, or Q1 2020 levels. Um, so in terms of supply, that supply is definitely coming back. If you look at some of the foreclosure starts numbers from from other organizations, you're seeing eye-popping percentage increases of hundreds or even thousands of percent in foreclosure starts. And
Mm-hmm.
so I don't but even with those percentage increases, I wouldn't even describe this as a wave of foreclosures. I would describe it as a gradually rising tide, because we're
Okay.
not even back to the pre-pandemic levels in terms of supply, but it is coming back. And then in terms of demand, um, we saw demand drop off. It was that V-shaped thing that we saw in the early months of the pandemic, where the demand metrics we look at on our website, which are sales rate and price execution relative to the credit bid, um, those dropped off for a month or two, and then they
Mm-hmm.
came roaring back. And investors realized, okay, this is still a great fundamentally sound market to buy in. And there was limited supply of the distressed property specifically to buy at a discount. And so demand came roaring back, and we're seeing demand metrics that we've never seen before, even before the pandemic, in terms of the percentage of properties that are selling and the price points they're selling at, which may not always be good news. They're still selling below after repair market value. There's still an opportunity for investors there,
Mm-hmm.
but that has narrowed a little bit.
Geographically, uh, are there any markets that are well above or below, kind of capture your attention when you kind of peel back the layers of data, either on the
Yes,
supply or demand side? Yeah.
yeah, and this is maybe we can throw up this slide potentially, or you can go to auction.com/in the news to get this. But um, I have a heat map showing where we're in the first quarter by state, where we're seeing foreclosure volume come back the fastest and the slowest.
Mm-hmm.
And basically, I benchmark again to first quarter 2020 levels. And when you look at that, so the on the heat map, the green, picture this in your mind. The green is where we're seeing the numbers come back faster, and the green is mostly in the Midwest and the Rust Belt. A prime example is the state of Indiana, which actually in the first quarter was at 108% of its pre-pandemic levels. So it actually was above pre-pandemic levels, even though the entire country is at half of its pre-pandemic levels. Another one that stands out is Oklahoma, 98% of pre-pandemic levels. Um, but then on the other end of the spectrum, if you look at this, we're seeing states states like New York is a prime example at 32% of pre-pandemic levels. So it's below that national average. It's coming back slower, which we kind of suspect with a state like New York, to be honest. Um, and let's see here. Yeah, some in the Northwest, like Oregon, is at 13% of pre-pandemic levels.
Wow.
Um, Now, some of the high volume states are kind of in the middle. California is at 42% of pre-pandemic levels. Florida is at 46% of pre-pandemic levels. Texas actually is a little bit lower. It's 30% of pre-pandemic levels. So there's definitely a mix depending on how the foreclosure process works, whether it's through the courts or outside of the courts, and also just state level regulation or level legislation that maybe has impacted the foreclosure process during the pandemic, slowing it down. We are seeing different levels of volume return.
Do you think there are? How do you think we as a country, and you can pick specific states or markets, but how do you think the foreclosure moratoriums worked? Like, would you grade them in that process? A, B, C, D. Pick another scale to grade it by. Like, how do you think our collective reaction to COVID and the concerns around housing, um, how do you think that panned out now when we have hindsight 2020?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I would grade it probably a B.
Okay.
Um, I in some ways it accomplished the foreclosure moratorium combined with the forbearance program
Hmm.
really accomplished what it set out to do, which was to prevent kind of the pandemic from triggering a crisis situation
Hmm.
and a wave of foreclosures all of a sudden hitting. It gave people time in this period of uncertainty to respond to the shock, to make sure that they were okay, um, and not just fall into foreclosure because of this unforeseen kind of natural disaster. And um, I would liken the pandemic more to a giant national natural disaster as opposed to what triggered the recession and the housing crisis back in 2008, which is a whole different other set of things, kind of internal. This was more of an external shock. And
Right.
the great thing is that the mortgage industry had kind of refined their response to natural disasters and preventing just these knee jerk foreclosures from happening. In some of the hurricanes and floods that had happened in Texas and Florida in 2017. So I would rate it a B in terms of really preventing a crisis that would have potentially brought down the housing market with it. The reason I go B instead of A is I think that it it was a blanket moratorium for the most part. The one thing that they did really well was they exempted vacant and abandoned properties. So vacant and abandoned properties or abandoned properties could be foreclosed on. So that's why we saw an increase in volume even during the moratorium.
Hmm.
Is the servicers were able to figure that out and say, okay, for sure these properties are vacant or abandoned. We should move forward. That was a really smart move to because those properties are just sitting there and it represents supply that the market desperately needs.
Yeah.
And if they're just sitting there, they're just potentially creating more blight. So that was a good move. But then I would say it was still a little too blanket of a moratorium and lasted just a little too long out of an exercise of caution. And what it has done is it has contributed to the lack of supply in the country because foreclosures, they're not a huge source of supply, but they're an important source of supply for investors who are renovating those properties. They're often not, it's not just the vacant and abandoned ones, but the other ones are often very close to being uninhabitable. And so
Yeah.
investors are taking what's inventory that's really not viable inventory and converting that to inventory that's great. And we see actually that most of our properties that are resold by our buyers are sold to owner occupants. And so by holding on to that moratorium, we believe a little bit, I believe personally, a little bit too long, it has contributed to this supply shortage in a small way.
Let's keep on that topic, the supply shortage piece, because there are so many factors contributing to it, right? You had effectively overbuilding pre-Great Recession, right? And then you have real estate crash and building just drops like a rock. And the next 10 years, like leading up to COVID, construction was just slowly creeping its way back up. And it wasn't even close whenever COVID broke out, wasn't even close to pre Great Recession levels. So we were not overbuilding. We were, if anything, underbuilding leading into COVID. And then COVID hit, you have lockdowns. That just scraped everything for a long time. And as we sit today, all of the issues that affect every part of a consumer's life. You have supply chain issues, parts, labor, uh, all of these problems. Permitting is taking way longer in most markets than it did pre-COVID. All of these contributing factors that continue to keep supply suppressed. Do you have any finger on the pulse of whenever we're going to have, a healthy 6-month supply of housing?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we do see it on the new home side, the supply coming back now. Part of that is supply chain problems, is that it's holding up some of the supply in construction, and they're not, and the builders have stopped selling some of their properties before they're completed construction because they are so far behind. But we are seeing the supply in the new homes market at hovering around that kind of balanced 6 months of inventory for the last few months. So that's kind of an early sign. Usually, the new home sale market is a leading indicator of the existing home sales market. But yeah, we're still at I believe it's around 2 months or less supply at the in the existing home sale market, and it did tick up a little bit in April, which is good. And I mean, I think the best thing that can happen is we see that balance come back to the market, which puts downward pressure on home price appreciation, which has gotten out of control. As to when that will happen, it's hard to say. I would guess, my best guess would be by the end of this year we'll see that. I mean, the combination of the builders have definitely ramped up supply during the pandemic. That takes a while to make its way into the market.
Mm-hmm.
Um, then you do have the foreclosure moratorium has been lifted, so that's one small source of supply. We think it's an important source of supply. And then that combined with cooling demand, we would expect to see as a result of rising mortgage rates, should help to balance things out by the end of this year. Um, we that demand really hasn't cooled too much, but there are some early signs that we're starting to see that cool. Certainly on our platform, we're seeing investors uh, still very strong demand from our investors, and we actually surveyed our investors just recently. And what was really interesting was that over half of our buyers describe their market as overvalued with a correction possible. So they see that there's some frothiness in this market because of the rapid home price appreciation.
Mm-hmm.
But then they're still super confident about selling into this market, because and so the evidence of that is that 86% of them say they're planning to increase or keep the same their property acquisitions this year compared to last year.
Okay,
Um,
that's interesting.
so and when I talk to them, I've talked to a few just individually
Mm-hmm.
to get more color. And this is kind of varying off a little bit from your original question, but I think it's
Yeah.
important because I see our investors as a leading indicator, and they're always looking out 6 months ahead into the market, what the market's going to look at like 6 months from now. And so they do see there's an increased risk of a slowdown in home prices and even potentially a correction in some markets. But they're confident because the type of inventory they're dealing with is inventory that's on the lower, more affordable tier of the market, which the demand for that is typically more solid.
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, I would say, well, there's three things. So secondly, they because these are distressed properties, they're adding value through innovation, which is not as dependent on home price appreciation. They can still actually make a profit even if home prices don't go up in a lot of cases. Um, and the third thing is the rental market is so strong. So even though most of our buyers, their primary strategy is renovating and reselling, they have that they can hold those properties as rentals if they need to in a softening market. and the rental market is still very strong. So that's what gives them the confidence.
That's promising to hear that feedback from your base. And yeah, we didn't even touch on it, and we don't have enough time to. But the rental side of the fence, right? HPA gets makes a lot of the noise, but I think rental appreciation is something that COVID at the crazy rates of growth has become a headline as well. So definitely, but like you said, the silver lining there from an investor standpoint is that you have flexibility, you have optionality, and whenever you have uh, a decent bit of uncertainty in the market because you have so many variables changing and shifting all over the place, whether it's rates, HPA, is it going to cool off? Is it going to keep on exploding ahead? Supply chain, labor issues, go down the line. Optionality with how you can dispose of a property or just pivot your strategy. That has to, like you said, add some certainty from an investor standpoint, and definitely feeds into the confidence that kind of you saw whenever you surveyed your base. Daren.
Yeah, and that survey was in March, so it was fairly recent. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. Never enough time, my friend. I'm already thinking like how soon can I get you back on for another episode? I appreciate you jumping on here so quickly. Always a pleasure to chat with you. Auction.com, the best company name in the industry, right? Like Auction.com tells you everything you need to know right out of the gate. Daren, thank you, my friend. I really appreciate you.
Thank you, Dalton. Pleasure to be here.
Great. Thanks everyone for listening. Take care.